A very warm good afternoon to everyone. I am Ram, co-founder of Pride Circle, and I am honored and delighted to have eminent panelists Arvind and Saurabh with us to talk about, legally speaking, the next steps for LGBT plus inclusion in India. And a warm welcome to everyone for the second day of Rise today. And we'll start with a quick introduction for both the panelists. And Saurabh, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Well, I'm a lawyer, and that usually ends conversation. So I'm a lawyer, senior advocate practicing in the Supreme Court and the High Court, and I call myself an accidental activist. That's pretty much it for the time being. The rest, you can read about me if you are so inclined.
Thank you. Arvind?
Hi, my name is Arvind Narrain, and I'm, I think, to follow Saurav's line, I'm also a lawyer come activist. Maybe less accidental than Saurabh.
Thank you, and just want to call out thank you for taking out time to talk with us and the amazing work you're doing in the space. And whether accidental or intentional, both of you have contributed significantly to the space of LGBT plus inclusion, especially the legal landscape we are able to breathe a tad bit easier today in this country. So thank you so much for all the work you have done and all the lawyers in this country. And starting with that question itself, what is the Indian legal context when it comes to LGBT plus inclusion today? If you can talk a little bit about Section 377 and the NALSA verdict, which happened in 2018 and 2014 respectively, how has the country transformed since then to now?
Well, I think I'll just go ahead, Arvind, if you don't mind. I'll just take 2 minutes. I'm sure your audience will be pretty aware already of the legal developments, right? It's taking course to Newcastle. We all know that the NALSA judgment has come, recognizing third genders, which has now been effectively made into an act, Transgender Protection of Rights Act, which has its own failings. We'll discuss it in its own time. And the other, of course, is Section 377, the reading down of Section 377 to decriminalize homosexuality, right? So that's a legal sphere. So today you can have sex in private between same-sex couples and not go to jail for it. But that's pretty much it as far as the law by itself stands. The judgment itself has a whole lot of reasoning behind it, which gives the LGBTQ community a fair bit of rights, which go beyond just decriminalizing Section 377. But those are a set of tools that will be used eventually and on case-by-case basis to expand the jurisprudence to have the next lot of cases that we have to fight. So the way the LGBTQI rights stand in India today, you can be a trans person, you can have certain recognitions by the NALSA judgment and the Act, and 377. So that's pretty much it. The rest is all, I think, work in progress. We have a long, long way ahead, and we'll have to go at it little by little. And that's how law works.
Thanks. Arvind, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, thanks to Saurabh for a very succinct summary of the current position. I'll just add something to what he's already said, which is as far as the importance of the 𝘚𝘗𝘳 judgment, which of course he completely just made the point now, is the language which it gives you in terms of taking struggles forward. I'll mention only one part of the language which I think is particularly relevant to our anti-discrimination conversation, which is really the interpretation of the idea of what is discrimination. And there the judges come up with a very powerful line of thinking, where they view the problem with 377 as being based in certain form of stereotypical thinking. And stereotypical thinking, they say, violates your right to not to be discriminated against, which is a very important point, because as every gay and lesbian transgender person knows, the key issue you really face on an everyday basis is a sense of a stereotype which you face in your everyday world, and which ends up producing a certain level of discrimination as far as you're concerned. The perception that, for example, gay people are effeminate, the kind of humor that might accompany that around the cigarette breaks, and how that interferes with your right to equality, and that's the principle which is put in place. The other important principle which 𝘚𝘗𝘳 puts in place is the idea of dignity. The fact that when you make decisions about your personal life, about your intimate life, or who you choose to be with, that's really a part of your right to dignity. And when you impinge on that dignity, you hit a person's self-esteem. And that's something, again, which is very fundamental. You're again, going back to the Saurabh's book, the idea that you're taking sex outside the framework of a judgmental register into the framework of the right to dignity. That is, who you choose to be with is really part of who you are. And that's something which can't be interfered with either by society or by the law. So there's two principles which it sets in place. I'll stop with that. I think Saurabh's elaborated the other dimensions, and we'll try and cover all your questions. Otherwise, we won't be able to do it.
Thank you for that expansion. And taking from the right to dignity, right, and what we have looked at, the Nalsa judgment, what it set out for trans people, the right to self-ID, and what the Act did, it was not the ideal solution of what the Act does. So for the audience which does not know a lot of details, can you simplify the issues the trans community has with the Act, and what could be the potential solutions to that? And as an organization, how can they better support trans employees who, when they either look for documentation support or any of that, how can organizations support the trans employees?
The first thing you can see is the question of identification, right? The judgment said a trans person was to self-identify. And that absolute right has been watered down by the Act. Of course, the rules have come, and it seems to suggest for the time being that potentially some form of self-identification may work. But the Act in itself, when you read the text of the Act, leaves scope for a committee to determine as to whether your transgender status is correct or not, right? So you take your sexuality, which is intensely personal, and put it into the hands of bureaucracy to determine as to your status. Now, that is a deeply, deeply problematic thing. And the other issue I'll deal with, and I'll leave Arvind to deal with the rest. But since we are talking about employment, the Nalsa judgment specifically said that there should be reservations for the trans community because of the historical backwardness. So they were to be included in the other backward castes or classes, actually. Now, the Act is completely silent about that. There are no reservations which are provided for the trans community, and particularly, I think, certain subsects of the trans community. That was the argument that had been raised. But of course, when the judgment came, it was for the whole trans community. So there are no reservations that are currently given by at least public sector undertakings and authorities for the trans community. The private sector doesn't have reservations in any case, so obviously it will not apply to that. But at least in the public sector, the employment opportunities for the trans community are not as per the promise of the Act. Then you have questions, of course, of the extent and nature of punishment for abuses or of rights of the trans community, which some people feel are not commensurate to the degree of the nature of the offense. Now, that, of course, is a subject matter discussion as to whether it should be 5 years or 10 years, 15 years. But there is a feeling that crime against a trans person is not taken as seriously in terms of the quantum of punishment, i.e. it's taken a more lightly than a hate crime that it potentially is. So I think these are some of the problems that we have with the Act. And of course, some trans activists also have a problem with the concept of the third gender and the idea that it can be exclusionary if you're not a man, woman. It does not recognize the whole spectrum of gender identity. But I think with that, just a little hint of the issue, I'll leave the scope for Arvind, who's so much more eloquent than I am.
Thanks, Saurabh. Just to add to what you already just said, the question of the transgender rights framework really emerges from the Nalsa judgment. And the key principle of the Nalsa judgment is, as Saurabh has already indicated, the right to self-determination of gender. That is, you could be born a man and decide to identify as a woman. You could be born a woman and decide to identify as a man, or decide to identify as a transgender person. And that's the idea of self-determination, where you give persons the right to identify with the plurality of positions along the gender spectrum, as it were. And the predominant problem with the Act is it does injustice to the idea of self-determination of gender, because it literally sets up a two-step process along with the documentation requirement which Saurabh just indicated. That is, firstly, if you want to identify as a transgender person, you submit certain documents to the district magistrate, and then you can get your identification certificate as a transgender person. Then after that, if you actually a man who wants to identify as a woman, you have no step but to go through, no option but to go through a two-step process. First, you get a transgender certificate, then you apply for a modification of transgender certificate to apply as a woman. And to apply as a woman, if you're born a man, you have a higher barrier to cross, the medical, in terms of surgical intervention barrier which you have to cross. So just it does complete injustice to the idea of self-determination with respect to gender, to one's gender. And that's really the fundamental flaw with the act. And again, I think trans people are best placed to speak about this, and especially because post the act coming out, it's all this kind of protest really around the country by the trans community saying that we don't want this act. You're doing it for a benefit, we really don't want it. And I think this is the fundamental problem. When you have a community for whose purpose you ostensibly put forward the act, protesting strongly and saying we don't want the act, and still go ahead with the act, then it indicates the sense of contempt with which you take the trans community. The fact that they're not taken seriously by the political establishment of the powers that be. And that's the problem. The other quick problem is the entire question of, again, going back to your concern, I mean, your concern and the concern of this grouping, is the question of discrimination. The Trans Act actually puts out a very powerful understanding of the various spheres in which discrimination can operate. But the problem again is this kind of a superficial way of dealing with the problem, because there's no problem of putting forward a right if you don't have a remedy. And as far as the Trans Act is concerned, it doesn't define what is discrimination. It puts forward the context in which discrimination can happen, but doesn't lay out a remedy, as in who are you going to approach if you're discriminated against? What are you going to do if discrimination happens? And that's the fundamental gap. Some parts of it may sound good, but there's no delivery mechanism. Other parts of it are deeply problematic because they do injustice to the principle of self-determination of gender, which is there in NALSA, or they betray the great promise of the NALSA judgment. And Saurabh has already indicated with respect to reservation how that gap again has not been addressed yet.
Absolutely. What are the legally recognized genders a person can get on government ID cards in India today? On Aadhaar, PAN, voter ID, is it trans person? Is it third gender? What all can the person get on the legal identifiers today?
Arvind will probably better place to answer that.
Begin with that. It's a good question, and part of the reason why I think Saurabh saying will be better placed is because it is a complicated question, because it's just changing, right? And there's not a sense of solidity with respect to one answer with respect to every identity document. And my memory again is passport has a third gender, other as a third gender. I need to check that, but the other documents could have other possible options. And the Trans Act, in a sense, comes up with this new framework, right? The new framework which I just described is the two-step identification process. So one thinks that the Trans Act will become the standard by which all other identity documents will now begin to be guided. And so that will be the framework. That is, you need to get. If you need to get a male or female, you go through a surgical intervention, you go through trans certificate, and move on to the next step. So that will become the framework, is my guess. It's a little bit of fluidity because of the coming into place of the Trans Act itself.
Do you feel like the gender-coded laws of India will make a space for a transgender kind of a law? Like, let's say income tax, like there's a separate slab for male versus female. Will there be something like that coming up for a trans person? Do you foresee that, or do you see any merit in that?
We get back to the point of the Trans Act, right? The Trans Act would have been a way in which you could have dealt with the range of these problems, wherein you're saying that, we're looking at the question of discrimination. Discrimination be in the civil sphere, it can be in the criminal sphere, it can be in the family law sphere, it can be in numerous spheres. But then, if there is a discrimination, you must have a remedy for that discrimination. The Trans Act would have set up that kind of a remedy which is not there. So, if there is a discrimination with respect to insurance law, if there is discrimination with respect to income tax law, of course. I mean, you're entitled to a remedy vis-a-vis that particular discrimination.
You just jump in there. When you talk of gender bias laws, right? Generally, laws in India tend to be gender neutral. There are exceptions, however. For instance, the Domestic Violence Act and certain other acts which prevent the Sexual Harassment Act. But most importantly, I would say the Domestic Violence Act is the most commonly used act and of course that does not include transgender. So there'll be, I wonder how that will pan out. I suppose the matter will go to court, and the court will be called upon to examine that issue, and then maybe the protection can be extended to a trans community. So that is is a problem. But in terms of, say, insurance and other problems you talked of, that's not gender, that's very gender neutral in any case. That is not relationship neutral. That is a problem, I think. The idea that if you're as a couple, whether you can get same-sex or trans and a different male or female joint insurance, those are issues. But that's not really specific to the trans community where gender neutrality. That is more of a relationship issue, I think, status issue.
And in the absence of all these remedies, which is not available in the Trans Act today, what are the spaces that organizations can do? What are the things companies can do better to foster inclusion, particularly for trans community and more from the LGBT perspective, like same-sex partner insurance coverage, transition insurance support, even like a gender-neutral posh policy? It covers all kinds of harassment and discrimination in the workplace. Any thoughts on that?
I'll just jump in and I just give a very brief idea of what I think in any case. I think the biggest problem that members of the queer community face is what has to be addressed first, which is discrimination at the workplace, right? It's not it's not these big issues about insurance which necessarily bothers a person. It is the daily harassment of going to work and facing a discrimination. Now, you need an organization to have a coherent, explicit, published anti-discrimination policy, and as Arvind said, remedies. Now, supposing there is a violation of your right to equality, or you feel you're being discriminated against, there must be some named authority that you can move. Now, the law does not provide for any anti-discrimination code, right? That's true for irrespective of gender, even on basis of caste or religion. In the private sphere, you can theoretically discriminate. So it's up to companies themselves to come up with best practices. And so that is, I suppose, your question. What can companies do? I think to me, the most obvious thing is to have an anti-discrimination code in place, publicize it, have some some sensitization and awareness of people, and then have effective redressal. Have committees which have neutral people from outside the company who engender some trust and faith in the person making the complaint. It should not be that things are just brushed under the carpet, right? So, but all of this will be relevant only if you have a community that you develop in, or a system you develop in your company where people feel safe enough to go and make a complaint, right? There must be safe spaces. Your company must have an environment which is a safe environment to work in. And that takes more than just codification. That takes sensitization.
Just to add to that, what Saurabh already indicated, I think he's got it right. The core problem people face is really in questions of employment. I mean, you're there in the office and you're facing discrimination being trans or being gay or being lesbian. That's a fundamental problem. And very often people are isolated. They don't necessarily have the way to deal with this framework of discrimination which is all around them, you know. And so what is it that you can do to help people navigate this system? And I think that comes, I think we're a little outside the sphere of law in the sense that you don't need an answer from lawyers here. What you need to say is what is the right thing to do and do it. Either in the interest of corporate, in the interest of increasing your employees' capabilities, or in the interest of protecting the rights of your employee, etc. Right? The law doesn't prohibit you from doing anything to protect LGBT persons. In fact, if anything, if you read 𝘚𝘚𝘯𝘓 closely, it mandates that you should do something, right? And so the argument would be that you should go ahead and you should show the fact that your guys are real leaders and do something to improve the situation of LGBT people at the workspace. Give you one example. Again, to me, the memory of this is, again, the question of the importance of corporates having a certain sense of courage. Post the Suresh Kumar Kaushal judgment in 2013, a lot of corporations said, we can't do anything because the law is criminalizing LGBT people. Our point is, no, it's criminalizing certain sexual acts. You can do everything you want to. Please go ahead and protect your employees. There's nothing preventing you. And now you have 𝘚𝘚𝑗 in your favor. You have NALSA in your favor. So there's nothing preventing you from, as Saurabh says, going ahead with a strong anti-discrimination policy in the interest of protecting all those who face any kind of discrimination basis of sexual orientation or gender identity at the workspace.
So while there's nothing preventing the companies to do, and there's no barrier legally, could they what is the avenues for individuals who are discriminated against? While there are a lot of organizations are doing really good work in terms of having very clear policies around non-discrimination, they are affirmatively hiring from this talent pool, and a lot more is happening in India today, thankfully. But there's still a majority of LGBT plus people who are at workplaces who don't even recognize that LGBT people exist. What avenues do they have if they are facing discrimination, if they are facing harassment at the workplace?
The absence of a company policy and having some internal mechanism, the only other solution you can have is if there is some law in place. Now, unfortunately, there is no code of anti-discrimination which exists in India, which protects people on the basis of their sexuality or indeed even their sex, frankly. But in the private sphere, if you are discriminated on the ground of your sexuality, there is unfortunately very little you can do about it. You could theoretically go to court and ask for judicial intervention. And the way Vishakha came in, right? At the point when Vishakha came in 97, there was no law which prohibited sexual harassment at the workplace. The Supreme Court felt there was a lacuna in the law and felt that it was part of your right to dignity, as we talked of earlier. And you could not have a working environment which upheld your right to dignity if you were harassed at the workplace. Now, I can potentially see an extension of that line of reasoning by the courts. So if some courageous person who unfortunately has faced discrimination does not have an avenue within their company, then goes ahead and pursues a legal remedy, a constitutional remedy in court by filing a petition in the High Court or the Supreme Court and asking the court to lay down certain guidelines as to how a private company is supposed to act, then there is some hope. There's no guarantee that the court will intervene and do something. But as we discussed earlier, the precedential value of judgments is precisely this, is that each case lays a base for the next case. We have as a charter of rights in the 𝘚𝘦𝘯𝘷𝘰𝘤𝘢 judgment, right? We have to use those tools and then approach the court and say, it's all well and good to say, I have my Article 21 right, which is right to life, which gives me autonomy, dignity, all these beautiful sounding rights. But when I come to practice them, then I have no legal recourse. So the court must fashion something as a remedy, allowing you to go and approach them if there's a violation of some of your rights, which stem from Article 21. But that's my perception.
Yeah, just to add to that, the gap in the law is quite clear. So what we need is really a kind of a campaign to get in place an anti-discrimination law which covers all the bases of discrimination. There was a bill which was proposed, a private member's bill by Shashi Tharoor, which looked at the issue of discrimination grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity, as well as other markers. Again, this is an important point because even if you look at the question of caste, look at the question of gender, the question of discrimination other than sexual harassment is really not covered within the legal framework. So there's a fundamental gap as far as discrimination law is concerned. So I think that's if you asked us, what should our next step be? It's clearly, this is a very, very important part of a next step in terms of triggering a campaign and pushing the state or pushing the political parties to take on both the issue of discrimination and start moving towards the legislation on this point. It's very, very important. The gap is there and we have to address that gap because as we talked about it, the starting point is what the kind of discrimination people face in both in workspaces as well as schools and colleges. Again, that's a very important space, right? I mean, Ram, you can imagine that in schools can be the particularly brutal and cruel space as far as kids who are gender non-conforming are concerned. I mean, they might not be gay or lesbian, bisexual, transgender, one doesn't know. At that age, maybe...
Brutal for gay, cisgender kids as well, and at least I had a brutal school experience.
Yeah, they face that bullying, right? And so how do you deal with these forms of discriminatory action based on stereotypes in schools, colleges, workplaces? That's really fundamental. And we need, one level, we need legislation. Another level, we need enlightened organizations, groups, etc. to start implementing it in their workplaces because nothing is stopping them.
Is it any better for trans people? We talked about that there's no non-discrimination for gender sexuality, but did the Trans Act provide for any of that for transgender people?
So Arvind said that there are no remedies, but again, I think he's more aware of this. Like, there's no point giving a right, but no remedy. No point saying discrimination is outlawed, but there's nothing you can do about it if you are discriminated, right? But I'll let Arvind.
Yeah, no, just to reiterate the same point, we just discussed this already. In fact, in the rules, the trans rules which are under discussion, some of the proposals which went to the ministry at that point were trying to remedy this gap, this gap in terms of saying that, there's something like what the Sexual Harassment Act sets up. Can the law mandate setting up committees in every workspace, right, to address the question of discrimination as well which trans people face or may face? Unfortunately, the government didn't take to that, and the rules have nothing on this question of of this remedy dimension. So we're still left remediless, as it were. At present, that I think there are a couple of petitions in the Supreme Court challenging the Trans Act. We'll see if anything comes out through that process as well.
And just to step in here again, it's not just about the trans community. These issues relate to more than just that. It is the entire queer community, but also, as we said, queer intersectionalities, question of caste, religion, and most importantly, sex, right? Forget sexual harassment. Suppose you hit a glass ceiling and you're not getting a promotion because you're a woman. Frankly, there's nothing you can do about it because the law permits that. There is no anti-discrimination code which exists. And the law caters currently to a very small section of upper caste men from the religious majority. So really, we need to form alliances. We need to have, as Arvind pointed out, activism, and also have and hope, therefore, some legislative change will arise, but also through the courts. But it is more than just the trans community, this form of discrimination.
Two questions I have here. One is about the fluidity within the trans identities, right? Like as you talked about, some people have issues with third gender, some people, we also now saying like non-binary identities. And while one idea of self-identity and that fluidity is great, but how do we codify that? And I think probably that two-step process of either as trans and then a male or female. But what if people who do not identify with either gender? What could be the legal framework for such identities?
Ram, you should be having trans people answer this question. It's not fair to answer this question.
Yes, I feel wrong answering on behalf of a community which is already so disadvantaged. It just is like quasi mansplaining here. So I feel guilty answering these questions.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So. And the other question is about the POSH policy, and more organizations are now having a gender-neutral POSH policy. Like it's a recommendation to have a woman when it comes about investigation. Should there also be LGBT plus people part of the ICC committee when it comes to discussing cases around sexuality and trans identities?
Of course, I don't think if there's. It should be the entire gamut of the form of discrimination that takes place, right? If you have an accusation of same-sex sexual harassment, it's not necessary to have a gay person always or a queer person on the committee, but it can't be that there's always just a cisgendered person on the committee. So there must be a variety of people we can draw in the pool, and that can be on a case-to-case basis. So the way, of course, typically the sexual harassment that a woman faces, a gay man may not be able to understand that, right? So it also has to be context-specific. So I think in a case of a sexual harassment against a woman, your experiences of being a woman are so different that to have a man who happens to be of an alternative sexuality on the committee may not be just and fair. But there may be instances where it is. So I don't think you can have a one-size-fits-all. You need to have a panel of people, a broad-based panel of people who you can call upon, and that must reflect the nature of harassment that exists in our society.
Absolutely. Arvind, would you add to something?
No, I agree with Saurabh on this part. Yeah.
Next steps. Section 377 was kind of foundational in India. What are the next steps for the country at large when it comes to LGBT inclusion and from legally speaking? Is it marriage equality? Is it employment protection, adoption, inheritance? And what is the timeline you foresee of any of it to happen?
Well, just jumping in here. You see, I have a problem sort of with this question, in as much as these are all forms of discrimination against the LGBT community, right? It does not mean you have to focus on just one. Surely we have enough bandwidth to focus on many, many things, because each of these issues will have a different kind of way it has to be attacked. The form of marriage equality, for instance, you can simply go to court as petitions have been filed, and that's one form that will take place. In case of discrimination, you have to do more than just go to court. You have to mobilize, you have to have activism. So that has to happen parallelly, right? So I won't say what's the next thing. You have identified the problems for the community. Each of them have to be dealt with. And I hope we can empower ourselves and other people and our allies. We form alliances, have intersectionality, to remedy and try to attack each of these problems, right? And as regards timelines, now that is a question, as we said, you ask trans people, ask them questions. This question should be posed to a soothsayer or an astrologer, because frankly, I can't predict as to how long it will take to get rid of discrimination against the queer community. But if history is any answer, discrimination against women was outlawed or prohibited in the Constitution of India in 1950. We're in 2021. I don't think it's gone away, discrimination. So while there will be bits of law we can change, bits of discrimination we can nip away at, we start with low-hanging fruit maybe, but it's a long, arduous path ahead, and one which will require constant effort on the part of the queer community.
Yeah, just to add to that, actually, I think it's very difficult to say what the next path is, primarily because the community is so diverse, so many voices, and so many people, so many things which are important to them, And I mean, this is a lesson we learned from really around the world. And activists might say that, the next step is an anti-discrimination law because you feel that's very important, and rightly, it's very, very important. But then some person who's no connection to the community will file a petition saying we want to get married because that's very important to that person, And as activists, you say that you're to be able to say that, hey, that's an important issue because it matters to that person, that's very important from the framework they're covering. And end of the day, all these end up being very, very connected because if you win in one area, we'll have a trigger impact in the other area as well. And I think on the marriage question, at least, I mean, if you read 𝘚𝘚𝘯𝘓, I mean, for at least my reading is for all practical purposes, Justice Chandrachud is saying it's an issue of discrimination. If marriage is not recognized, or some form of relationship is not recognized. So there's a strong basis for a petition as far as that is concerned. At the same time, we see the world that we live in, and we see in terms of the UP Love Jihad ordinances, where the issue of intimate choice is coming under attack very, very strongly by the right wing. So the question, of course, I mean, which is the question which again nobody can answer, but the question we have to be aware of is there a possibility of a certain form of backlash as far as the marriage question is concerned? Are we seeing that? I mean, it's a question again. Are we seeing that at the ground level, where, for example, if a Muslim man and a Hindu girl end up getting married, they face enormous pressure at the ground level. If two gay people or two lesbian people start getting married or start living together, is that relationship going to face increasing pressure at the ground level? These are all questions of activism in terms of we might very well have to be prepared for stronger level of organizing at the ground level to address or to provide support for people who will come under attack in the time going forward. But then again, the question of, I mean, what is your path to the future? It can only be your path, because the number of people we have in this country, everybody will have their own path, and they will, because we have so many possible options. People will start moving in each of these paths forward, as it were.
And that's the perfect segue to my next question. And while going through your book, Sex in the Supreme Court, which is a fabulous book, and I recommend everyone to pick up and read. It's very simplified understanding for a common person to get a sense of how laws are passed in the Supreme Court and what goes into it. And one thing that stood out for me was the intersectionality. I think it's most evident in law, like how different kinds of judgments around intercaste marriage, interreligion marriage, autonomy to self-body kind of ties into and provides a framework for the queer community to push forward for that. Would you like to talk about that?
Well, that is how our constitution is, right? Our constitution puts the individual, as I said, in the center of the constitutional firmament. It is the individual whose right is most important. Their dignity, their autonomy is most important. Now, the dignity and autonomy of an individual can have many facets. But as long as you recognize and value that innate autonomy of the person, the fact that they choose to express it through the sexuality in one aspect of their life, their religion in another, their caste in another. Now, obviously, they tie into the sense of who that person is. And if the constitution is committed and the court is committed to protecting that person's autonomy and dignity, they will have to reach out to each of the injustices that are meted out in the different spheres of their life that they talk about. So the love jihad is one aspect of it, as Arvind pointed out, that if you have no autonomy to marry outside your religion, that is a problem, and therefore the court will protect that. Same thing with caste. Both, of course, in India, we have the unique position of banning marriages which are intercaste, but also within the caste. So we have same gotra marriages, which is effectively the same caste. Even that's not okay, right? Because we regulate marriages, and marriages are seen as something beholds the individual almost sometimes. Yeah, but since the constitution places the individual in the center of its consideration, therefore it's inevitable that you will have intersectionalities, and that's a good thing, surely. That's an important thing, and we must never forget that no one is alone in any of the fights that we have, and that's something to remember.
And that could be a great segue of building allyship across different sets, so that we can push for a better equality for everyone in the country. Arvind, any thoughts on that?
Just to take up Saurabh's point on the individual at the center point, I think it's a very, very important point. And just the thought which came to my mind, which I'll share, is Akash Singh Ratho's book on Ambedkar's preamble makes a very interesting point. It says the preamble or language is fraternity assuring the dignity of the individual and the unity and integrity of the nation. At that moment in time, it was fraternity assuring the dignity of the individual and the unity of the nation when the constitution was drafted. And at that moment, some person made an amendment saying that it should be fraternity assuring the unity of the nation and the dignity of the individual. And Ambedkar was very clear. So there should be dignity of the individual followed by unity of the nation. So the lexical priority of the individual of the unity of the nation is a philosophical priority of the individual of the unity of the nation. And it's really an understanding that the only way you'll safeguard the unity of the nation is by protecting the dignity of the individual. And that's what Saurabh very eloquently put, right? Your choice in matters of caste, in matters of religion, matters of gender, and matters of sexuality is so integral to who you are. And if we don't protect that dimension of individual dignity, we can't protect the unity of the nation. So that's the importance of dignity and individuality, which is what Saurabh just highlighted. I'll just add one last point to this, is if you go to 𝘚𝘦𝘯𝘓, the judgment of 𝘚𝘚𝘯𝘓 and Justice Chandrachud's opinion, he makes a very interesting point on Section 377. He says, he talks about it as, he says that it criminalizes the right to love. And he says the right to love is not just a right for the LGBT community, it's a right for all of us. By which is indicating the intersectionality of struggles. The fact that, if you win this battle, as far as the LGBT community is concerned, it'll have a cascading effect on other battles as well. And the fact that when you're looking at the protection of dignity, which is your right to choice, then your choice across lines of caste, across religion, across sexuality, across gender, is actually the same principle, which is dignity. Which is why that's so fundamental and so key to this idea of intersectionality.
Thank you so much. This has been so enlightening. And I wish we had more time to talk more about various other aspects about the law and the LGBT plus identity. Any closing comments for the audience you have?
Nothing. It's just that what's most important for the next steps of the queer community is really for people to come out and be counted. It's very, very, very important to have discussions like these for people, for really organizations to empower their employees. It's really, through this, I speak to the CEOs of people in positions of power. You have opinion makers and influencers in parliament and judges. We try to reach out to those all the time. But really, I think a very large part of the struggle has to happen through empowering of the individual. I just talked about the dignity of the individual. And ultimately, we have to empower the individual. And one of the most important methods you can do that is ensuring them a good workspace, a decent workspace, which is free from discrimination and hatred. Right. So I would beseech through your channel, the powers that be who are listening, if any are, that please make the changes that we talked of.
Thank you, Arvind.
Yeah, just to add to that, actually, is really the importance of the power of the idea of community, which is when people are individual and isolated in the workspace, it's sometimes very difficult to move forward. But once people feel that they can work with other people, or they're part of a larger grouping, then change becomes very possible and very, 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 almost very thinkable and very doable. So it's very important for us to get outside our own individual silos and work with other people to break that sense of isolation and to make change happen.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This was wonderful. Thank you for taking time out, and I'm 100% sure a lot of our audience will take it back and implement both on the aspect of enabling and empowering individuals and building community within workplaces. Thank you so much, Saurabh.
Thank you for having us. Thanks, Arvind.
Thanks, Saurabh. Bye.
And continuing the conversation on legally speaking, we have Sudha joining us from NVIDIA. Sudha, it's such a pleasure to have you here. Please go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Ram. So as Ram said, I'm Sudha. I'm based out of Bengaluru. I'm a lawyer by profession and deeply passionate about driving inclusion forward in all spheres of life. I take pride in being a diversity and inclusion practitioner, but taking tiny steps towards influencing the ongoing cultural revolution. With over 2 decades of legal experience after completing my law from Delhi University, I currently head the legal function for a leading technology company for its business operations in India, Singapore, Thailand, Australia, and New Zealand. I'm happy to be part of the RISE conference.
And we are delighted to have you here. Thank you so much for making it. And we were just talking to Saurabh and Arvind about the legal context in India, what has the journey been till now, and what the future looks like. And because you come from corporate law background, quick question for you is, what are the things that companies can do to make a safe and inclusive workplace for the LGBT employees, given the current legal framework in India? Like, for instance, same-sex partner insurance, transition insurance coverage. What are the things that organizations can do today?
See, Ram, as my co-panelists also had mentioned in their conversation, the first thing is interest, right? There has to be interest, then comes sensitization, and then it's action by actually investing in the D&I measures. So, until some years back, Section 377 was considered as the monster. There was a lot of cheer and hope that, we don't have those restrictions anymore. I have highlighted in my previous discussions as well that Section 377 really was not, the only hindrance for organizations to take up any kind of inclusive activities, or, were they actually hiding behind this as the law that stopped them from being more inclusive towards the LGBT community? So just to give a quick thing that we have heard this already in our discussion, that 377 was only criminalizing sexual acts that were considered against the order of the nature, sex that was not for procreation. But practices between consenting adults that they indulged in their private space was not something that concerned the workplace inclusivity. So that we have to be, cognizant about. Several organizations earlier also, even before the decriminalization of Section 377, had launched employee resource groups and a lot of other benefits for the community. But post 377, has the conversation been easy for the organizations to openly show their support and start the employee resource groups? Then the answer is yes. So even if it was because of lack of understanding, the fact remains that 377 was used as a shield for inaction. And over the last few years, a lot of organizations, such as mine also, and in all sectors across, have made huge strides in supporting lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender employees and creating an inclusive workplace. So what all is feasible for workplaces? Employee resource groups can be initiated, programs can be designed specifically to support LGBT people. There is no two ways that diversity will help draw top talent and foster innovation. And we all understand that people will perform significantly better when they can be themselves at workplace. But it may be true that many LGBT people also, they choose not to disclose their sexuality at work. And a lot more LGBT and queer senior executives have not come out at the office. So what remains at workplace a lot of times is, a fear of homophobia, exclusion, maybe being passed over for promotions and job interviews. These are still very real issues for many LGBT people. And this needs to be addressed at the workplace. Businesses have to demolish, the career barriers that we feel. So how do we reduce this workplace discrimination? It is basically by providing support to employees who identify as LGBT in the workplace. So just as a few steps, we have to develop and communicate a clear mission for supporting the LGBT in the workplace, not just to all employees, but we have to get a buy-in from the senior executives and the management, organize diversity trainings and sensitization programs so that the conversation is started and people are encouraged to ask questions and stigmas, around this topic are eliminated. We have to establish strong anti-discrimination policies that are gender neutral, and even for recruitment and promotion practices. So all employees must know that if any homophobic bullying is happening, it will just not be tolerated. There has to be zero tolerance for these things. Then, as I just mentioned again, we have to develop support groups, There have to be mentoring opportunities for LGBT employees, drive initiatives to promote allies at workplace, and all this is in addition to, we have to make sure that we incorporate LGBT friendly benefits. So benefits are very crucial. So equal benefits should be offered to all employees regardless of their sexual orientation and gender. For instance, parental leave, if we have to take time off to take care of dependents, such things, And in our policies, we have to use inclusive language consciously. There have to be gender neutral washrooms at work. There have to be same-sex partner benefits that have to be extended, medical insurance benefits, support sex reassignment surgery if somebody decides to go for it. So these are some of the things where we can take huge strides further, but we avoid thinking about this section of the society because we consider this invisible. We don't really, as organizations, we have a huge bargaining power, but we don't negotiate with the insurance agencies, right? So I think these are some of the things that we can definitely, as organizations, think about.
So what are you effectively saying is there is a great room space for organizations to do as much as they can to foster LGBT inclusion. Legally, there's no hurdle in that sense.
Absolutely.
Talking about the flip side of it, and you very clearly called out that a lot of people face and don't come out because they either are facing active homophobia or transphobia at the workplace, or they fear that if I come out, I'll be passed over for a promotion or a career opportunity and all of that. But there's still a large section of the community that's still actively facing discrimination at the workplace. What recourse they have? What are their way of seeking redressal for discrimination at the workplace in Indian workplaces today?
See, I talked about, having gender neutral policies, and also in terms of enforcement, there has to be zero tolerance in terms of anything where some of the employees facing any such issue. So we have to understand that policies, procedures, and law is one thing, but we have to actively work on the mindset as well. So we can have a fantastic grievance redressal mechanism where we are providing this platform to people to, irrespective of their gender, no matter what they face, they can come and complain. But as you rightly admitted, that there are many people who have not even come out at workplace. So would they actually admit if they are hearing homophobic jokes in an informal setting at workplace? Would they actually go and complain, or would they quietly just kind of, bear it and feel suffocated, not be able to perform and not be able to come out of it? So having a setup is one thing, which definitely organizations should provide in terms of a grievance redressal mechanism. And there is nothing that stops us because every organization is primarily driven by the employment contract, the terms of the employment contract that they have, which has to be, gender neutral, which has to be inclusive and equal for all employees, irrespective of their gender or their sexual orientation, and the policies and practices that we have internally. So even if there is a complaint that is lodged, it has to be as per the company's policies. And if the disciplinary committee takes these things seriously and ensures that there is action out of any such thing that's happening at workplace, it will set an example.
So what I'm hearing is like your set of policies should definitely be gender neutral, but also there should be significant investment to build that trust within the organization that people feel safe enough to even report such cases and seek redressal. Right?
That's
Thank
right.
you. Switching to trans employees, when it comes to trans inclusion, there is a lot that has happened from NALSA verdict to the Trans Act, but still that's not a very clear set guidelines on what are the officially recognized gender when it comes to Aadhaar, PAN, all of that. As an organization that is being inclusive and they want to give a gender expansive opportunity for trans people, non-binary people to identify the gender they are, what options should organizations give besides male and female?
See, third gender should definitely be a part of, the gender options that are provided. And while obtaining Aadhaar card, there are three options, in fact, an option to identify as a male, female, or third gender. Voter ID also does have that option now. CBDT has amended Form 49A to include transgender as a category. We may have trans-specific laws in India so that the third gender is adequately protected. But we also need to see amendments in terms of, if we just speak about the legal scenario in the Prevention of Sexual Harassment Act and the Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act to include transgender. Because the protection of women under the Domestic Violence Act, it does cover live-in partners now. but it's silent on, same-sex partners. It doesn't talk about it. And also, as we see around the way the, societal mindset is shifting, soon we may have someone. So it is also that nobody has actually come out of it and complained, right? Because there was an instance in Delhi, a Delhi University student had complained against harassment under 354A, and Delhi police had, and this was a transgender, identified as a female. The Delhi police had refused to take a complaint, saying that she does not fall under the definition of 354A. So Delhi High Court had proactively, they had heard the petition of the student from the Delhi University who wanted to lodge this complaint against male students who were basically harassing her, sexually harassing her. So they had directed the police to lodge a complaint. And that's where, she was actually given protection under 354A. So what I was saying was that when some, members of the community actually come out and complain, our judiciary has been active in kind of taking a step forward and solving these problems.
So,
chicken and egg thing.
Yeah, so while there's an overall larger framework, nothing is stopping organizations to be proactive. And when it comes to the outside workplace, like the legal framework within the country, it will be case by case, refining and tweaking to include trans people. But largely everything that is available to non-trans people should still be available to trans people. And it will take few cases to get that corrected and sorted in the various codes. But that's effectively what you're saying, right?
I have always emphasized that we can always do better than what the law suggests. So there is nothing. So law specifies the minimum basic which an organization is supposed to do. Law doesn't, penalize you for doing something better than what has been suggested. So in any of these, whether it is prevention of sexual harassment, whether it is domestic violence, whether it is same-sex, partner insurance, or any of the benefits, the law doesn't prohibit it. So the organizations cannot say that since there is no law, they are not bound to do it, but there's nothing that stops them from doing it as well.
That's a really important point. Thanks for bringing that up. Last question on this. What are the common challenges from a workplace perspective when it comes to inclusion of LGBT community? What do they struggle with when it comes to inclusion?
So, see, for me, again, it's going to be from an outsider's perspective of what I have seen and what I have experienced. And that, in my view, is, accepting that it is a mindset challenge. And mindset challenge, when I say that we have to develop a progressive mindset, I was talking about, these invariably we get into these offensive jokes based on sexual orientation in informal settings, not recognizing that this is a form of harassment, right? And in terms of challenges, what I see is that there are not many role models. There are not many people who have come out. We need more people talking about it, so that, others feel that it is normal, it is okay to talk about it. They don't feel the stigma attached to it. There has to be a wider representation of gay and trans people, whether it is in business or in all spheres of life, right? And not just that, this will also be encouraged if we see more straight allies to be vocal about their support, right? They need to take a stand. So when these changes happen, I'm sure, societal change requires more than a judgment. So judgment is one thing. Homosexuality may not be punished by our statute, by our law, or by any books. But if society continues to punish them when they seek education, if they don't feel comfortable getting educated, when they seek employment, when they go for housing, if they're discriminated there, so then it is a very long drawn battle for them. A lot of members of the LGBT community continue to live in shame. And a lot of them are still oppressed, even though Section 377 was, decriminalized homosexuality. Even then, and it's been more than 3 years now, but transgenders are still ostracized, even within families. Forget about the external part of the society, right? And they are forced to seek out communities which survive on the fringes of the society. So this way, if we don't bring them within the inclusive setup of the society by this mindset change, society is just going to continue to wash their hands off, because this community, like I said, we don't see a lot of them. We consider them as invisible. It can clearly just be brushed off under the carpet. We don't have to talk about it, right? And because of these, we are just kind of, anybody who does not conform to the heteronormative standards, we are excluding them from law enforcement. And also they become, sometimes they become victims of police brutality. So we have to make sure that they don't continue to live as members, as unequal members of society. We have to make sure that they're brought into the main fold, right? By normalizing these conversations.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing those wonderful insights. And we look forward to carrying on this conversation and making change in all our spheres of influence, as individuals, as allies, as organizations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ram. I just want to add one point as I, close my comments, that our workplace is an extension of our own mindset, and we need to work upon that, right? The society we live in, and that's what needs to be fixed. And I hope that we're going to get there sooner than later.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.